Hello, students. Welcome to the third lecture on Introduction to Indian Writing in English. In the previous lecture, we discussed how the 18th in the 18th century, Indian writing in English, Indian writings influenced by colonialism begins to take its shape and what kind of a political and academic environment it um, was existing in the 18th century and as the 19th century was dawning. In today's lecture, we'd be talking about the 19th century and how two things especially that happened in 19th century. One, the introduction of colonial education and how it impacted vernacular literatures being written in the 19th century. So these are the two things that we'll be discussing in this lecture. So arrival of English education happens in a context of a particular controversy at the beginning of the 19th century. It was decided that a British colonial education was necessary in order to create a class of Indians working for the British administration to make sure that there is a class of people working between the colonial administrators and the mass they are ruling. So how this education should be initiated, what kind of an education it should be, was widely debated. A particular debate that is of interest to us today is that one between the Anglicists and the Orientalists. So the Anglicist versus Orientalist controversy comes to its peak in 1835, and the debate is between whether an English or a Sanskrit education should be provided to Indians through the British colonial apparatus. Ram Mohan Roy was among the leaders of the Anglicist school of thought who demanded a British education should be delivered to Indians in English and the shackles of Sanskrit be removed. But others, like Horace H. Wilson, campaigned for an Orientalist education where Sanskrit would be the medium of education for Indians to create a class of people compliant to the wills and whims of the British administrators. But in the same year, in 1835, things were decided when Thomas Babington Macaulay comes out with his Minutes on Education, which later came to be dubbed as Macaulay's Minutes, in which he clearly states, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect." So Macaulay's Minutes ensure that a colonial education would be administered to the Indians in English language. The group of people who are created that is described by Macaulay, the interpreters of Macaulay's Minutes, are described in later in 1995 in his novel Moose Last Sigh by Salman Rushdie as Bloody Macaulay's Minutemen, English medium misfits, square peg freaks. This class of people that Rushdie is describing here in this colorful language was mostly made up of the Bengali Bhadralok, who were gentry, um, landed class of people from the hinterlands of Bengal who migrated to the cities, especially Kolkata, for an English education and for opportunities in the British administration. So this group of people is later described as the Bloody Macaulay's Minutemen, and this group of people are significant to us in these discussions here also because it is these individuals who are British educated, who are English educated, who writes, who contributes to most of the Indian writing in English of the 19th century, and also the writes brings in a change. An avant-garde literature is brought into the vernaculars by these English educated young men. Let us take a look at how this effect of the colonial education is reflected in the vernacular plays and poetry written in the 19th century. So most of these influences originate in the Hindu College of Calcutta, and a group of young English educated young men who organized themselves under the title of Young Bengal. And the Young Bengal movement was inspired by Henry Vivian de Rosio, to whom we will come in a later lecture. He was a very, very young professor of the Hindu College, and he inspired many of the bright young minds of Bengal into this Young Bengal movement. And they wrote in a way that would bring the British mode of writing, the British norms of literature into the vernacular, especially Bengali. Some of the major works of this period of 19th century uh, among plays and poetry are as below. 1831, The Persecuted is written by Krishna Mohan Banerjee, and it is about a young Hindu Orthodox who loses faith in his religion. When he writes this, Banerjee is 18 years old, and later in his life, he loses faith in the Hindu Orthodoxy and converts to Christianity. He was one among the young Bengal, the group of Derosio's disciples. In 1835, we get the magnificent A Journal of 48 Hours of the year 1945, a speculative fable about the year 1945. In this work, Kailash Chandra Dutt writes about 110 years later. It's kind of first kind of speculative work written by an Indian. In this work, he writes about an imaginary armed uprising of educated middle class Indians against the British rule. So it is uncanny how close he comes to the actual year of Indian independence. And he talks about this 48 hours in which an armed uprising takes place, and leading to a toppling of British rule by this armed uprising is led by educated Indian middle class. So Indian independence movement was led by the educated middle class and was a toppling, even though it was not an overnight event like um, Chandra Dutt imagined it to be. It still happened around the same time that he had predicted in his work. In 1858, we get Padmini Ubakhyana. And in Padmini Ubakyan, Ranglal Banerjee, Ranglal Banerjee's project is to introduce English literary custom to his Bengali readers. So in, he draws from a British history by Colonel James Todd, which is called Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, and was compiled in 1829. So James Todd's Annals becomes a basis of a nationalist kind of a poem, which talks about this Rajasthani ruler who is fighting against a Muslim invader. But it is a story of how young Bengal is fighting against the British, but very well disguised in the guise of a historical event drawn from a British source. He ends on a note of British allegiance and praise of the British rule, but that was just to meet the demands of his time. He disguised very well um, the nationalist sentiment of his work. This is the same thing that later in 1882 Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya does in his novel Anandamad. He cunningly locates in the nationalist novel in the past so that he does not come directly under attack from the British administration. In 1861, Krishna Kumari is written by Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who was also inspired by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya to write in Bengali. So Dutt is known as the inventor of Bengali blank verse. He also drew on Todd's annals and wrote his work is inspired by the Bengali Renaissance and the writings of Raja Ram Mohan Rai. He claimed, Madhusudan Dutt claimed that he is not writing to the wider Bengali audience, but to the specific class of Bengalis who are attuned to Western education and a Western sort of thinking and are free from the servile admiration of everything Sanskrit. So his project was to free the Bengali mind from the uh, servitude to Sanskrit and to um, and to appeal to those young Bengalis who were inspired by English education. These are some of the verses and plays of 19th century. Now moving on to the prose. It is important to note that before 19th century, there wasn't much of prose being written or widely popularized in India. An awareness of the potentials of prose comes through an imperial education, through the colonial education, and the features of especially the journalistic prose of 1840s and later is that it was more aware of social problems and the theocentric view of earlier writings, especially the verses, Sanskrit verses, the theocentric worldview of these Sanskrit verses were replaced by a rational worldview. A spirit of inquiry was imbibed into the writings of Indians and also a desire to examine one's own past. These are very much Western philosophical characteristics of literature, and this was imbibed into vernacular prose in this century. Most of the novels and prose written in this period is modeled after uh, English literature and was being written in vernacular tongues. Not written in, most of it was being written in vernacular language, but it was inspired by British writings. Some of the major influences are The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith, Sir Walter Scott's novels, and novels by many minor Victorian novelists like Benjamin Disraeli, Bulwer Lytton, Mary Corelli, Wilkie Collins, and G.W.M. Reynolds. They were a major influence to Indian novelists mainly because it was their novels that was widely available in print and widely circulated cheaply to a large variety of Indian readership. So these acted as a major influence in this early phase of novel in India. Among the major novelists of 1866 and 1889, Nanshankar Mehta of Gujarati, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya writing in Bengali, Samuel Vedanayagan Pillai writing in Tamil, M.V. Rohalkar writing in Marathi, Kantakuri Veerasalingam Pantulu writing in Telugu, and O. Chandumenon writing in Malayalam are of note. You might be familiar with O. Chandumenon's novel Indulega, which is understood as the first novel in Malayalam. Most of these writers listed here writes the first novel in their vernacular tongue, and their project is to bring the ideas of the novel, the characteristics of novel, which one of the major characteristics of the novel is its realism. O. Chandumenon says in the preface to his novel that his project was to replace the supernatural kind of writing that is being done in Malayalam and to make Malayali readership aware of realism and the British mode of writing novels about what is about the ordinary and the mundane lives of people that we see around in a language that is often used in our everyday life. This was a project that Chandumenon took up in Indulega, and this was a very, very widely received and popular novel. Within 30 years of its publication, multiple reprints were done, and the novel was very, very popularly and widely read and received by the wide Malayali readership. In the next lecture, we'll be looking at what happens towards the end of the 19th century and how the attitudes of Indian writers towards English language and the British mode of literature changes with the advent of nationalist ideology. Thank you.